The rope over Hacksaw Ridge. The rope hung over the edge of Hacksaw Ridge like a lifeline to hell, its hemp fibers already darkened with moisture from the pre-dawn mist that clung to the coral cliffs of Okinawa. Private First Class Desmond Doss knelt beside the anchor point, testing the knots one more time while the sounds of the night's carnage still echoed across the plateau above. Spent shell casings littered the muddy ground around his boots, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, wounded men called out in voices that grew weaker with each passing hour. The 77th Infantry Division had held this section of the ridge for 3 days now, but holding was a generous term for what actually happened here. Each morning brought fresh attempts to clear the Japanese positions carved deep into the coral caves below, and each afternoon brought stretcher after stretcher of casualties back to the aid station. The ridge itself was a maze of shell holes and broken coral where every piece of cover had been fought over and paid for in blood that the April rains never quite washed away. Captain Morrison crouched beside Doss, his uniform torn and stained from the night's fighting. His eyes held that particular exhaustion that came from counting casualties instead of tactical gains, from writing letters to families he'd never met about boys who'd never make it home. "The order came down 20 minutes ago," he said quietly. "We're pulling back to the secondary line at 600. The brass wants to reorganize before we try again." Doss looked up from the rope, his hands still wrapped around the coarse fibers that had become his only tool for reaching the wounded scattered across the killing field above. The cliff edge dropped away into darkness, but he could hear them up there. Voices calling for help, for water, for their mothers, for anyone who might still care enough to climb back into that maze of death and coral. "What about the wounded still on top?" "That's not our problem anymore," Morrison replied, though his voice carried no conviction. "Battalion says we've done what we can. The Japanese own that ground now." The rope seemed to pulse in Doss's hands like something alive, each strand telling the story of the men they'd lowered over the cliff during the night. 17 wounded soldiers had descended that rope since sunset, each one a testament to what became possible when retreat wasn't an option and leaving the wounded wasn't acceptable. His palms were raw from the constant friction, bandaged with medical tape that kept slipping in the humid air, but the pain felt distant compared to the voices still echoing from above. Sergeant Williams emerged from the fog, his bar slung across his shoulder and his face grey with fatigue. He'd watched Doss make trip after trip up that rope, hauling medical supplies and courage into situations that defied tactical logic. "You did good work tonight, Doc," Williams said. "But the captain's right. We can't hold this position, and we can't keep feeding men into that grinder." The morning light was beginning to seep through the mist, revealing the true scope of what the 77th Infantry Division had been fighting to control. Hacksaw Ridge stretched out like a coral fortress, its edges dropping away in sheer cliffs that made every approach a killing field. The Japanese had turned the plateau into a maze of interlocking fields of fire, where every shell hole and piece of cover was zeroed by mortars and machine guns hidden in caves that seemed to multiply like cancer. But Doss wasn't looking at the tactical situation. He was listening to Private Henderson's voice, weak and desperate, calling from somewhere near the center of the plateau, where he'd been pinned since the afternoon assault. Henderson was 19 years old, from a farm in Ohio, and he'd shown Doss a photograph of his girl just yesterday morning. Now he was trapped in the open, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, waiting for help that military logic said couldn't come. "There's still men up there," Doss said simply. Morrison studied the medic's face, seeing something that made him deeply uncomfortable. There was no arguing with that kind of quiet determination, no military procedure that covered a man who refused to abandon the wounded even when ordered to withdraw. "The rope stays rigged for now," Morrison said finally, "but when that order comes to move out, we move, with or without volunteers." As the fog began to lift, revealing the broken coral landscape of Hacksaw Ridge in all its savage detail, Doss wrapped the rope around his waist and prepared to climb back into the darkness above. Somewhere behind him, he could hear Williams muttering prayers that sounded more like curses, and Morrison checking his watch with the mechanical precision of a man counting down to a decision he didn't want to make. The voices from the plateau grew more desperate as the dawn light made them easier targets for the Japanese gunners hidden in the caves below. But the rope held firm, and Desmond Doss had learned long ago that sometimes the only choice that mattered was the one between leaving and staying, between following orders and following conscience. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The climb up the rope to Hacksaw Ridge's plateau was like ascending into a different world, where the normal rules of survival had been suspended and replaced with something far more primitive. Doss pulled himself hand over hand through the morning mist, his medical pack bouncing against his back with each movement, while the sounds of scattered gunfire echoed off the coral walls around him. The 77th Infantry Division's positions on the ridge had been carved out of solid rock and determination, but holding them required a mathematics of ammunition and casualties that never quite balanced. The plateau itself defied every tactical manual Doss had ever read. Shell craters pocked the coral surface like lunar landscapes, connected by shallow trenches that offered minimal protection from the plunging fire that came from caves hidden in the cliff faces below. The Japanese had turned the entire area into a killing field, where every piece of cover was pre-sighted by mortars and machine guns, where movement in daylight meant accepting death as a probable outcome. Private Henderson lay wedged behind a chunk of broken coral about 50 yards from the rope anchor point, his legs twisted at angles that spoke of serious fractures. When he saw Doss emerge from the cliff edge, his face showed the kind of relief that came from hours of believing he'd been forgotten. "I knew you'd come back," Henderson whispered as Doss slid into the crater beside him. "I heard the others saying you would." Doss began checking the boy's wounds with practiced efficiency, his hands working automatically while his mind calculated the tactical problem of getting a wounded man across 50 yards of open ground that the Japanese had turned into their personal shooting gallery. Henderson's left leg was clearly broken, probably in multiple places, and blood loss had left him weak and shocky. The sound of voices carried across the plateau, other wounded men scattered among the coral formations who'd spent the night waiting for help that military logic said couldn't come. Doss counted at least 5 distinct voices, maybe more, each one representing another trip up that rope, another journey across ground that belonged more to the dead than the living. "How many others are out there?" Doss asked. "I counted maybe 8 or 9 before I stopped looking," Henderson replied. "Martinez is hurt bad, over by that big crater, and there's a new kid, Johnson, pinned down near the cave mouth. He was crying for his mother most of the night. The rope that connected the plateau to safety seemed impossibly far away, as Doss considered the mathematics of rescue. Each wounded man would require individual extraction, individual risk, individual defiance of the orders that said this ground was no longer worth American lives. But mathematics had never been part of his decision-making process, not when it came to choosing between tactical logic and human need. A rifle shot cracked overhead, followed by the distinctive sound of a Japanese machine gun opening up from one of the hidden cave positions. Dust and coral chips rained down on their position as the gunner searched for targets among the shell holes and debris. Doss pressed himself against the coral wall, feeling Henderson's body tremble with fear and pain beneath his hands. "They know we're here," Henderson said unnecessarily. "They've always known we're here," Doss replied, continuing his examination of the boy's wounds. "The question is whether we're going to let that stop us." The morning sun was beginning to burn off the mist, revealing Hacksaw Ridge in all its brutal clarity. The plateau stretched out like a moonscape of broken coral and twisted metal, where every depression held either a wounded American or a dead one. The 77th Infantry Division's advance had died here in a matter of hours. broken against defenses that turned conventional tactics into elaborate forms of suicide. From his position in the crater, Doss could see the rope hanging over the cliff edge like a thread connecting two different worlds. Below lay the relative safety of the American lines, where medics and stretcher-bearers waited to receive whatever casualties could be evacuated. Above lay this coral hell, where wounded men waited for rescue that every military manual said was impossible. The voices of the other wounded carried across the plateau with desperate urgency. Martinez was calling for water, his voice cracked and weak. Johnson was whimpering somewhere near the cave mouth, probably delirious with pain and fear. Each voice represented another name on the casualty lists that would be typed up later, another telegram that would arrive at a family farm or city apartment, another empty chair at a dinner table that would never be filled again. But Doss had learned to translate those voices differently. Each call for help represented a choice between abandonment and risk, between following orders and following conscience. The rope over the cliff edge wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a lifeline that connected tactical retreat to moral advance, that made the impossible distance between safety and duty something that could be measured in individual climbs and singular acts of stubborn faith. "We're going to get out of here," he told Henderson with quiet conviction. "All of us." Henderson managed a weak smile. "You really believe that, don't you?" Doss checked the field dressing on the boy's leg wound one more time, then looked across the crater-pocked plateau toward the other voices calling from the coral maze of Hacksaw Ridge. "I have to," he said simply. By noon, the sun had turned Hacksaw Ridge into a furnace of coral and desperation, where the heat shimmer rising from the broken plateau made the Japanese positions waver like mirages. Doss had made 4 trips across the killing field, hauling wounded men, one by one, to the rope that dropped over the cliff edge to safety. Each journey revealed new horrors carved into the coral landscape, where the 77th Infantry Division's assault had died in a mathematics of machine gun fire and mortar fragments. The rope had become the axis around which everything else turned. Each wounded soldier who reached that anchor point represented another small victory against the tactical reality that said this ground was lost, that the men scattered across the plateau were acceptable casualties in a larger strategic picture. But Doss had long ago stopped thinking in terms of acceptable losses and strategic pictures. His world had narrowed to the distance between one wounded voice and the next, between one more trip across the coral and one more man lowered to safety. Martinez had been the hardest evacuation so far. The young soldier from New Mexico lay crumpled near a large shell crater, his chest torn open by shrapnel that had missed his heart by inches. By the time Doss reached him, Martinez was delirious with blood loss and pain, calling for his sister in rapid Spanish while his body went into shock. Getting Martinez back to the rope required a kind of stubborn faith that bordered on the supernatural. The boy couldn't walk, could barely remain conscious, and moving him across 50 yards of open ground meant exposing both men to concentrated fire from the cave positions below. Doss had fashioned a crude drag stretcher from his poncho and 2 broken rifle stocks, but pulling an unconscious man across sharp coral while Japanese gunners used them for target practice pushed the limits of what human determination could accomplish. The voices of the other wounded continued to echo across the plateau, each one a countdown timer, measuring hope against blood loss, medical supplies against time. Johnson, the replacement who'd arrived just 2 days earlier, was still trapped near the cave mouth, where morning reconnaissance had discovered a Japanese machine gun nest. His calls for help had grown progressively weaker throughout the morning, until now they came only sporadically, mixed with delirious rambling about his hometown in Wisconsin. Captain Morrison's order to withdraw had been delayed twice, but radio messages from battalion made it clear that patience was running thin. The 77th Infantry Division couldn't afford to keep troops in place just to support one medic's private war against tactical reality. There were other objectives, other ridges to take, other battles that required the resources being expended on this coral monument to impossible rescue missions. Division wants a final casualty count by 1400 hours, Sergeant Williams reported, as Doss prepared for another trip across the plateau. They're planning artillery preparation for the next assault, and they need this area cleared of friendlies. Doss paused in his equipment check, understanding the implications. Artillery preparation meant saturation fire, meant turning the plateau into a moonscape where nothing could survive. It also meant a deadline for the voices still calling from the coral maze above. "How long does that give us?" "Maybe 2 hours," Williams replied. "Maybe less if the Japanese start moving reinforcements into those caves." The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. 5 wounded men still scattered across the plateau. 2 hours of daylight before artillery made rescue impossible, and a rope that could only handle one evacuation at a time. Each trip across the killing field took at least 30 minutes, assuming no complications, no extended firefights, no medical emergencies that required field surgery under fire. But Doss had learned to ignore arithmetic when it conflicted with conscience. The rope hung over the cliff edge like an anchor line to something deeper than tactical logic, something that measured success in individual heartbeats rather than strategic objectives. Each wounded soldier who reached that anchor point represented a choice between abandonment and risk, between following orders that made military sense and following convictions that defied explanation. The sun beat down on Hacksaw Ridge with merciless intensity, turning the coral into a reflecting surface that made every movement visible to the Japanese gunners hidden in the caves below. The plateau had become a shooting gallery, where rescue attempts provided entertainment for enemy machine gun crews, where medical evacuation turned into elaborate forms of suicide disguised as heroism. From the rope anchor point, Doss could see the entire tactical situation with brutal clarity. The 77th Infantry Division held a narrow section of the ridge top, but holding was a generous term for positions that could be eliminated by concentrated mortar fire. The Japanese owned the caves, owned the approaches, owned every field of fire that mattered. Military logic said this ground was lost, that further casualties were unacceptable, that strategic retreat was the only rational response. But logic had never been part of Doss's decision-making process when it came to choosing between rational response and moral imperative. The voices calling from the coral maze weren't strategic considerations. They were individual human beings with names and families and girlfriends whose photographs they carried in shirt pockets, now stained with coral dust and blood. The rope pulsed in his hands like something alive as he prepared for the next trip across the killing field. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder, a reminder that time was running out for the voices still echoing across the broken plateau of Hacksaw Ridge. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope over Hacksaw Ridge had become something more than equipment by the time afternoon shadows began stretching across the coral plateau. Each fiber seemed to hold the weight of decisions that defied military logic. The accumulated tension of men lowered to safety one by one, while Japanese gunners searched the cliff edge for targets. Doss wrapped the line around his waist with movements that had become ritual, each knot a prayer, each turn around his body a commitment to choices that couldn't be undone. Johnson lay trapped near the cave mouth, where morning reconnaissance had revealed a Japanese machine gun position. His cries for help growing progressively weaker as blood loss and dehydration took their toll. The boy was maybe 18, fresh from Wisconsin farmland, and he'd been calling for his mother since dawn, with the kind of desperate honesty that combat strips down to its essential elements. The tactical situation had deteriorated throughout the afternoon. Radio intercepts suggested Japanese reinforcements moving through the cave systems below, and artillery observers reported muzzle flashes from new positions that hadn't been active during the morning fighting. The 77th Infantry Division's foothold on Hacksaw Ridge was becoming more tenuous with each passing hour, held in place only by stubborn determination and the knowledge that wounded Americans still lay scattered across the coral maze above. Reaching Johnson required crossing 40 yards of open ground that 3 different machine gun nests had already zeroed for interlocking fields of fire. Doss studied the terrain from his position behind a chunk of broken coral, mapping the shallow depressions and shell craters that might provide momentary concealment. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Move fast, stay low, and trust that Japanese gunners might hesitate just long enough for him to reach the next piece of cover. The dash across open ground became a sprint through hell, where each footstep on coral rock seemed to echo like gunshots, and every breath carried the metallic taste of fear mixed with determination. Machine gun fire erupted from 2 positions simultaneously, traces burning lines through the air, inches above his head, while coral chips exploded around his boots like deadly confetti. Johnson lay wedged against the cave mouth, his uniform dark with blood from multiple shrapnel wounds. When he saw Doss slide into the depression beside him, his face showed the kind of relief that came from hours of believing death was the only visitor he'd receive. "I thought everyone had left," Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of gunfire. "Nobody gets left behind," Doss replied automatically, though the words felt inadequate for the reality of what staying meant. Getting Johnson ready for evacuation required medical work under conditions that defied every principle of field surgery. The boy had taken shrapnel in his abdomen and right arm, wounds that needed immediate attention, but would have to be treated while Japanese gunners used their position for target practice. Doss worked with practiced efficiency, his hands steady, despite the knowledge that each minute spent in the open increased their chances of becoming permanent residents of this coral graveyard. The rope seemed impossibly distant as he considered the tactical problem of moving a wounded man across ground that offered no concealment and less hope. Johnson couldn't walk, could barely remain conscious, and carrying him across 40 yards of killing field meant accepting exposure that bordered on suicide. But suicide was a relative term on Hacksaw Ridge, where staying alive required daily redefinition of possible and impossible. "Can you hold on to my shoulders?" Doss asked. Johnson managed a weak nod. "I think so." The journey back to the rope became a crawl through purgatory, where every yard gained cost precious time and energy, while Japanese machine gunners adjusted their fire to track 2 moving targets. Doss half-carried, half-dragged Johnson across coral that cut through uniform fabric and skin with equal efficiency, leaving a trail of blood drops that would mark their passage long after they'd reached safety or died trying. Halfway across the open ground, Johnson lost consciousness. His dead weight made movement nearly impossible, but stopping meant certain death for both men. Doss adjusted his grip and continued the crawl, pulling the boy's limp form across coral that reflected the afternoon sun like broken mirrors. Machine gun fire tracked their movement with mechanical precision, bullets striking the rock around them with sparks and whining ricochets. The rope anchor point materialized out of the heat shimmer like a mirage that refused to disappear. Doss collapsed beside the cliff edge, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, while Johnson's unconscious form lay motionless on the coral. For a moment, the tactical situation seemed to pause, as if the entire battle were waiting to see whether this particular rescue would end in triumph or become another casualty statistic. Rigging Johnson for descent required a harness improvised from medical tape and equipment straps, a system that had never appeared in any training manual but had become standard procedure for evacuations that defied conventional wisdom. The rope stretched taut as Doss began lowering the boy over the cliff edge, each foot of descent a small victory against gravity and enemy fire. From below, voices called out confirmation that Johnson had reached safety, that medical personnel were taking over his care, that another wounded soldier would survive because someone had refused to accept abandonment as military necessity. The rope swayed in the wind off the ocean, empty now but ready for the next evacuation, the next journey between possible and impossible. But even as Johnson disappeared into the aid station below, other voices continued calling from the coral maze of Hacksaw Ridge. The arithmetic remained brutal. Wounded men scattered across impossible terrain, time running out before artillery made rescue attempts academic, and one medic with nothing but rope and stubborn determination to bridge the distance between abandonment and salvation. The secret that Desmond Doss would carry for the rest of his life had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with terror. As he prepared for what might be the final evacuation from Hacksaw Ridge, his hands shook uncontrollably around the rope that had become both lifeline and anchor to a reality that defied every military manual ever written. The 77th Infantry Division's positions were crumbling under sustained Japanese fire, and artillery preparation for the sector would begin within the hour, turning the Coral Plateau into a moonscape where nothing human could survive. The last two wounded men lay trapped near the center of the killing field, their voices growing progressively weaker as blood loss and dehydration pushed them toward unconsciousness. Private Wilson, a rifleman from Georgia, had taken machine gun rounds in both legs during the morning assault. Corporal Davies, a squad leader with 3 years of Pacific combat behind him, was pinned under a fallen timber with what appeared to be internal injuries that made movement potentially fatal. What the citation would later describe as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy fire felt from the inside like controlled panic barely held in check by stubborn faith and the knowledge that abandoning wounded men was simply not an option his conscience could accept. Each step across the Coral Plateau required conscious effort to overcome muscles that wanted to freeze, nerves that screamed for retreat to safety, and a rational mind that kept calculating odds that made survival increasingly unlikely. The dash to Wilson's position became a sprint through a gauntlet of machine gun fire that seemed to track his movement with supernatural precision. Japanese gunners in the cave positions had learned his patterns, anticipating his routes across the broken terrain with deadly accuracy. Coral chips exploded around his boots like fragmenting bullets, while tracers burned lines through the air close enough to feel the heat on his exposed skin. Wilson lay crumpled behind a shell crater, his face gray with shock and blood loss. When he saw Doss slide into the depression beside him, his expression mixed relief with something approaching disbelief. "You came back again," Wilson whispered. "They said you'd already made your last trip." "They were wrong," Doss replied, though his voice carried tremors that betrayed the cost of each return journey to this coral graveyard. Getting Wilson ready for evacuation revealed the true extent of his injuries. The machine gun rounds had shattered both femurs, creating wounds that required immediate surgery and blood transfusions that couldn't be provided on a plateau where medical equipment meant whatever could be carried in a single pack. Doss worked with supplies that were running dangerously low, using the last of his morphine and field dressings on wounds that needed hospital care. "I can't feel my legs," Wilson said with the kind of clinical detachment that meant he understood what shattered bones implied for his future. "Don't worry about that now," Doss replied. "We're getting you off this ridge." The evacuation became an exercise in controlled desperation, dragging an unconscious man across terrain that offered no concealment while Japanese gunners adjusted their fire to track two moving targets. Halfway to the rope anchor point, Doss realized that his own strength was nearly exhausted, that 3 days of rescues had pushed his body beyond normal limits into territory sustained only by determination and faith that felt increasingly fragile. The rope seemed to stretch under Wilson's weight as Doss began the lowering process, each foot of descent requiring careful management of a system that had never been designed for the stresses he was placing on it. From below, voices called out medical instructions and encouragement, but the words seemed to come from a different world, one where tactical logic still applied and impossible rescues remained impossible. Davies lay 50 yards away, trapped under a timber that required leverage Doss no longer possessed. The corporal was conscious but fading, his voice barely audible when he called for help. Reaching him would require crossing the most exposed section of the plateau, ground that Japanese gunners had been pre-sighting throughout the afternoon. The truth that would never appear in any official report was that Doss almost stopped. Standing beside the rope anchor point, his hands bleeding through the medical tape that bound his palms, he felt the weight of exhaustion and fear threaten to overwhelm the stubborn faith that had carried him this far. Every rational calculation said that attempting to rescue Davies would result in 2 more casualties instead of 1 evacuation. But rationality had never been part of his decision-making process when it came to choosing between abandonment and risk. The rope pulsed in his bleeding hands like something alive, each fiber connected to decisions that couldn't be undone, to wounded men who waited in the coral maze with trust that defied tactical logic. The dash to Davies's position became a stumbling run across ground that felt like running through machine gun fire while wearing a target on his back. Japanese gunners concentrated their fire with deadly precision, forcing him to weave between shell craters and chunks of broken coral, while exhaustion made each step feel like lifting lead weights. Davies lay pinned under a timber that had probably fallen during the morning bombardment, his face twisted with pain, but his eyes still alert. Getting him free required leverage that seemed impossible until desperation provided strength that came from somewhere beyond normal human limits. The evacuation of Corporal Davies would become the stuff of legend, but from the inside it felt like controlled collapse barely disguised as heroism. The rope held, the knots held, and somehow both men reached safety, despite odds that made survival a mathematical impossibility. 25 years later, Desmond Doss would wake from dreams where he could still feel the hemp rope burning through his palms, still hear the voices calling from the coral maze of Hacksaw Ridge. The nightmares always ended the same way, with him standing beside that cliff edge on Okinawa, calculating the distance between one more wounded voice and the safety of American lines, knowing that each trip across the killing field might be the last time anyone saw him alive. The official citation credited him with rescuing 75 men during his time on Okinawa, though Doss himself never counted beyond the faces he could remember, the names he whispered during prayers that had become as much about survivors' guilt as gratitude. The number seemed both too large and too small, too large to represent the exhausted terror he'd felt with each trip across ground that belonged more to the dead than the living, too small to account for the voices he still heard in dreams that refused to fade with time. The rope that had carried so many wounded men to safety was never found after the final assault on Hacksaw Ridge. Artillery preparation had turned the plateau into a moonscape, where even coral formations disappeared under the weight of sustained bombardment, erasing the anchor points and shell craters that had provided momentary protection during those impossible rescue missions. Sometimes Doss wondered if the rope had simply disintegrated under the stress, its fibers finally giving way after supporting weights that defied every principle of engineering and common sense. Captain Morrison survived the war and wrote letters to Doss every Christmas for 30 years, each one containing variations on the same theme. Gratitude mixed with bewilderment at what one unarmed medic had accomplished on ground. That tactical doctrine said couldn't be held, shouldn't be fought for, and certainly couldn't support rescue operations that bordered on elaborate suicide. The letters always ended with questions Morrison never quite asked directly. How does a man find the strength to keep climbing back into hell when every rational calculation says the next trip will be the last? The 77th Infantry Division's after-action report compressed the night fighting on Hacksaw Ridge into 3 paragraphs of tactical terminology that mentioned casualties evacuated and ground held, but said nothing about the weight of rope in bleeding hands or the sound of wounded men calling. For help, across a coral plateau, the Japanese gunners had turned into their personal shooting gallery. The report noted exceptional medical support under adverse conditions, but couldn't quantify what adverse conditions meant when applied to rescues that defied military logic. Wilson, the Georgia rifleman who'd lost feeling in both legs, spent 2 years in military hospitals before doctors managed to save enough muscle and bone to allow him to walk with canes. He wrote to Doss once, a letter that took 6 months to finish because finding words for gratitude that large required language that didn't exist. The letter mentioned dreams, where he could still feel Doss dragging him across coral that cut through uniform fabric and skin with equal efficiency, still see the rope dropping over the cliff edge like a thread connecting survival to something approaching miracle. Davies, the corporal with 3 years of Pacific combat behind him, never wrote at all. But his sister sent photographs every year on the anniversary of Hacksaw Ridge, pictures of children who bore his name, of family gatherings where an empty chair would have marked another casualty of tactical logic that said some wounded men were acceptable losses in strategic calculations that measured lives against terrain. The smell of hemp rope could still trigger flashbacks that left Doss shaking and disoriented, transported back to a coral plateau where wounded men lay scattered like broken dolls and Japanese machine gunners searched for targets among shell holes that offered concealment but never safety. Hardware stores became places to avoid, their coiled rope displays too reminiscent of nights when every fiber had meant the difference between evacuation and abandonment. The medal came with ceremonies and speeches that transformed terror and exhaustion into something approaching legend, compressing hours of controlled panic into phrases like conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty beyond the call of normal requirements. The words felt inadequate for the reality of what staying had cost, what each trip across the killing field had taken from muscles and nerves and faith that had been tested beyond normal human limits. But late at night, when rain drummed against bedroom windows with rhythms that sounded like distant machine gun fire, Doss would remember the weight of that rope in his hands and understand that some choices couldn't be measured in tactical terms or commemorated with medals that turned private terror into public inspiration. The men he'd lowered over the cliff edge of Hacksaw Ridge had survived because someone had refused to accept abandonment as military necessity, had chosen stubborn faith over rational retreat. The rope was gone, lost somewhere in the coral dust and artillery craters that marked the final assault on Hacksaw Ridge. But its memory remained woven into dreams that connected an aging medic to a plateau where wounded voices had called for help across impossible distance, where one man with no weapon had bridged the gap between tactical logic and moral imperative with nothing but hemp fibers and determination that bordered on the supernatural. In the end, that was enough. The rope had held when it needed to hold, had carried 75 men from death to life, had proven that sometimes the distance between impossible and necessary could be measured in individual acts of stubborn faith that defied every military manual ever written. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.